What celebrity death saddened you the most? Story 1. Mr. Rogers. It was pouring rain that morning, and I'd stopped to grab breakfast before a looming nightmare commute to work. Right as I was about to pull the key out of the ignition, I heard them say on the radio that he'd passed and just sat there in my car, sobbing. I met him in 1983 when he came to my elementary school with the purple panda, and for a 4-year-old, it was like meeting Jesus. I was so overcome I just blurted out, "You're my best friend." And he smiled and said, "I'm so glad that we're friends." We didn't deserve Fred Rogers. I think he's the celebrity the world needs most right now, though I think he'd be so disappointed in all of us to see how we treat each other. I still remember where I was when I heard he'd passed away. My high school band was at Disney World. I can't remember what park we were at that day, but there was a bust there of Mr. Rogers that was already covered in flowers when we got there that morning, and people of all ages were stopping there to pay their respects even though it was raining. It just showed how truly beloved he was that so many generations felt like they'd lost a friend when he passed. Story 2. Alan Rickman. My first movie intro to him was The Sheriff of Nottingham in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and I still threatened to take someone's heart out with a spoon. God's rest his soul. Story 3. Grant Imahara. His death was so random and unexpected, I genuinely didn't believe he died. For a couple days after it happened, I was silently convinced it was an internet prank. Watching the videos of Adam Savage touring his workshop was really hard too. Aneurysm is a silent killer. Even perfectly healthy people can get it suddenly, sometimes during the night. It's terrifying. You just go to sleep and never wake up again because of the faulty vein in your brain. Story 4. Steve Irwin, Sean Locke, and Shane Warne were a big kick in the balls as well. Sean, you could see he was ill, so unfortunately wasn't a huge shock, but still a massive loss. I must watch something with him daily. Also a loss for me, Rick Mayall. Story 5. Sir Terry Pratchett. He and his works both made the world a better, more interesting place. Terry Pratchett is the reason I evolved from a scared and nerdy introvert kid to the sociable nerd whisperer. He instilled in me the idea that the filters you use shape your reality, because the actual one is absurd, bizarre, weird, sad, and funny on every scale and step. It is up to us how we perceive and handle it. Thanks in GNU, Sir Terry Pratchett. Terry Pratchett is and always will be my favorite author. He could make me laugh and cry in the same sentence. Even now, years later, when I reread his books, I find references or subtleties I missed the last time. He died towards the end of my pregnancy with my youngest. It was a horrible, very traumatic pregnancy and a very dark time for me. His death made it worse, especially as his books always brought comfort. It has been several years since then, and I still cannot bring myself to read the last book, as I'm still not ready for it to be over. Story 6. Chris Cornell. So talented. Gone too soon and died so tragically, and his loss felt very personal to me. He had a beautiful voice, and Temple of the Dog came at an important time in my life. I still feel emotional when I hear his Johnny Cash cover, You Never Knew My Mind, which I think was written as a breakup song, but now sounds like a posthumous note to family and fans. Tragic and heartbreaking, but I'm glad he left so many wonderful performances behind. I opened this thinking Chris, but had no expectation to see him in the top comments. It makes me happy and sad to see him at the top. It really hurt when I heard the news. Story 7. Jim Henson, too early, and such a source of joy to so many. Every time I go to Hollywood Studios at Walt Disney World, I have to go to the Muppets 3D movie. It was the last thing he did as Kermit. It makes me sad that he died before the paperwork with Disney was complete, and because of that, a lot of the plans for the Muppets at that park never happened. Watch his funeral on PBS. It's one of the best celebrations of a human's life you can see. I happened to be at Disney World on the day that the Muppets partnership was announced. I was 9 or so. As my family was walking around the park, we stumbled upon the press conference with Michael Eisner and Jim Henson on a small makeshift stage. After a few minutes, they wrapped and my parents went to leave, but I was no longer with them. I'd snaked through the crowd and managed to get to the front and shake Jim Henson's hand. Closest I've ever been to historic level genius. He died less than a year later. Story 8. Heath Ledger. In 8th grade English class, we read Taming of the Shrew, and then the teacher let us watch 10 Things I Hate About You, to show us how his works still impact writing today. So I had just discovered Heath and had a massive crush on him when he passed away less than a year later. It was the first celebrity death that really impacted me. Story 9. Anthony Bourdain. I miss his snarky attitude. It's hard rewatching all his stuff now. Some of the things that he said really made me sit up and think to myself that we all miss the signs, and taught me to listen to people more carefully. I think it hit me because as a pessimistic sort of generally melancholy sort of person, I saw within him a kindred spirit with similar tastes and hobbies, etc. Seeing someone who kind of has an idealized version of a life I'd want and that they couldn't handle and make it out of here, so to speak. It kind of dampens the morale a bit when it comes to your own chances of finding peace and happiness. Story 10. Anton Yelchin. Dude had cystic fibrosis, and that isn't even what killed him. He's my go-to for this question. Poor guy had the whole world in front of him. He was in great movies, Hell, even his voice work in Trollhunters was great. And the way he went is just so random and awful. Not to say other deaths aren't tragic, but I think this was more so when compared to the natural death of someone 99 years old, or a drug-related death of someone or someone taking their own life. Story 11, Robin Williams. I loved that man. I'm still pretty torn up about him and Steve Irwin. Robin Williams had a full and illustrious career. I appreciate what he gave us in the time he was here. The manner in which he died was tragic, but due to the disease he had, he wouldn't have been happy sticking around. Story 12. John Ritter is the only celebrity death that I've ever cried about. It was so sudden and unexpected, and he seemed so nice. I cried all throughout the episode of 8 Simple Rules where they showed his TV family grieving his loss. Story 13. Chester Bennington. I bawled my eyes out and had to pull over and park my car when Leave Out All the Rest played off my Spotify playlist in 2019. It took on a whole new meaning for 2 reasons. I had recently moved to Florida after a really bad divorce, so I lost my entire support base of family and friends from my home state with that move. I'm South Asian, and the stigma of divorce and all of that stupid stuff that our community has weighed heavily on me because of what my parents were experiencing from people in their lives. The shame was getting to me. I was just driving around waiting for my flight back to my home state. I booked my flight the night before Christmas because I felt too ashamed to show my face to my family. Somehow I gathered the strength to purchase those tickets and come back to Michigan for a while. This song reminded me of how small this feeling was. That I had nothing to be ashamed of anymore, and that I also needed to leave those parts alone, so to speak. It was like a friend of mine gave me a ton of wisdom, love, and support. Then reality sunk in. He was gone for good. I took out what I thought was all of the Linkin Park songs from my playlists a few days after he passed, because I couldn't help but feel extremely sad when I would hear it. All the songs are back on my playlists now. But back in 2019, his death was still relatively fresh in my mind, and I thought I took out all of the band's songs. I missed this one, and I swear, it helped me so much. Wherever you are, Chester, I hope you have peace and tranquility. My only regret is not being able to help you, but I will continue to be compassionate and helpful towards others in life the way I have been. Thank you for helping me along with so many others, whether you know it or not, man. Story 15. Norm was the first celebrity death to bring me to tears. I loved Norm, loved his podcast, watched all his clips on YouTube, his TV shows, dirty work, his late-night appearances, his stand-up and weekend updates. My friends and I quote him all the time. He was a true professor of logic. His death reminds me of that tragedy. I didn't even know he was sick. He no longer is serving a youthful purpose. Story 16, Brittany Murphy. The documentary put out on her made it seem so preventable. Her story truly hurt my heart. Looking at this post, I see a lot of names that make me think the same. It really makes me think about how so many stars are used and manipulated for their worth, with no regard given to their personal health. If 1 or 2 strong friends or family members had stepped up and done something, we'd still have some of these people. R.I.H. Edit. Doc name is What Happened Brittany Murphy. It's super easy to look back and place blame and say, it could have been so easy, but the reality is, whether it's drugs or mental illness, you are limited in what you can do. You can't force people to get help. You can clear the path and do everything you can. But the final steps have to be theirs. Celebrities in particular have an added issue because there's a legitimate space where they can say, if you force me to change, you'll never work in this town again. And not everyone knows the extent of the issues, so they're going to take such threats at face value. Story 17. Chris Farley. Nothing like crying in front of your Christmas tree. Watched Chris Rock talk about his death on the Howard Stern show from like 15 years ago or something. He talked about how frustrating the inevitability of it felt. He said that the people that he was really mad at and would never forgive are the people who kept him just sober enough to keep making them money. You know, producers and people like that. Those cunts. They'd acknowledge the seriousness of his addictions and other issues by sticking him in rehab, then act like he was cured 30 days later, and throw him back into some production until he'd inevitably relapse and the process would start again. Judging at 18, James Gandolfini was an immense talent, and people often forget how The Sopranos changed the entire landscape of television. His acting helped usher in a golden age of television that's still going strong to this day. Story 19. Carrie Fisher, followed immediately by Debbie Reynolds. I felt so bad for Billy Lord's Story 20 David Bowie. That would be my pick, knowing he made his last album, released it, and then died 3 days later. It was beyond spooky, but also really cool and creative. Story 21 Chadwick Boseman. He was such a humble, thoughtful, and selfless dude. I remember watching 21 Bridges and Black Panther and wishing I was as badass and selfless as his characters were. Knowing he was battling cancer while working on several of his movies blew me away. He knew how important Black Panther was to people, and continued to train and study every day while battling cancer. Not to mention visiting children battling cancer and hoping to make their day a little happier. and a little easier. He continues to motivate me every day to be a more selfless and stronger person and remind me not to waste my life worrying about what others think of us and just doing what you know is right. He's one of the few people I look up to and strive to be like. Rest in peace. Chadwick Story 22, Dolores O'Riordan, R.I.P., waited in line outside a shopping center, J.C. Penney, to buy tickets. We were first in line, but had to snake through the store to their customer service center at the back of the store once the doors opened at the time of tickets going on sale. We ran back and made the first purchase. Row E? Damn. Thought we were going to be closer than that. We showed up and found our seats only to learn that rows A, D are speakers. We snagged front row tickets, and during the concert, Dolores came out and danced on the speakers while singing Linger. Top 5 memories. Story 23. Christina Grimmie. I saw her in concert a few years before she passed when she opened for Selena Gomez. Then a few months after that, she was on The Voice, and I voted for her as much as I could, even though everyone else wanted Josh to win since he was from my state. I also watched her YouTube channel for a while, but then didn't think much of it after that. Then a couple years later, I was woken up by a call from my mom telling me about some crazy fan sneaking in and shooting her. Even if she wasn't as big as a lot of other musicians, I think it was the first time I was really affected by a celebrity death. And when we thought things couldn't get worse, the Pulse shooting happened a day later in the exact same city. Story 24, Mac Miller. Gone too soon. I still get sad when his songs come on. IDK if it was because we were so close in age. He got famous while I was in high school, and everybody would play his mixtapes and albums. And as I got older, my taste for music changed, but so did Mac Miller's. It was incredible realizing how much he evolved and the quality of music he was putting out. One of the best of his generation, and gone too soon. Story 25, James Avery, Uncle Phil from Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That made me cry real tears when I found out that he passed away. That show was such a big part of my childhood. Robin Williams also broke me. Both broke my heart, and it still stings, even though I never knew them. IRL. Story 26, George Carlin. The world could really use him right now. Interestingly, I don't think George would be surprised by any of it. He pointed out this eventuality years ago. I remember an interview where he ranted about choice and how we only have the perception of it while governments and corporations have the power. I wonder what his advice would be. Story 27. Cameron Boyce. So young. This one upset me a lot, not on everyone's radar because he was a Disney kid. Definitely a shock when it happened. I'm older, but my kids are at an age where we spent a ton of time watching Jesse and those Descendant movies. Basically watched that kid grow up. He was ridiculously talented, had comedic timing down, could dance crazy good, and he just seemed like an all-around good human being. Didn't deserve to go that young. So unfair. Story 28. Bob Saget. It felt very sudden and random, and I was rewatching Full House and just watched the spin-off, so he was very much in my mind. Story 29, Avicii. It was a delayed saddening too. Not sure why, but it was a few years after his death I was listening to one of his tracks in a car, and it hit me hard. I had to pull over to cry it out. Story 30, Amy Winehouse. She was so talented. I always remember her very public deterioration, getting scary skinny, wandering around at night barefoot with blood and bruises, and then get really sad. Story 31, Prince summer of 2014, Prince got Twitter and used it to announce free shows at Paisley Park with about an hour's warning if you were lucky. One thing that really stood out to me was how much he seemed to love sharing the stage. He was private almost to the point of being reclusive, so I suppose that shouldn't be a surprise. But when his album with 3 Our Die Girl was released, he flew out Kendrick and treated the show like an opportunity to show off his favorite musicians. The man mentored Lizzo when she was still this hometown artist playing tiny rooms and not getting nearly as much recognition as she deserved. Then after he died, we started hearing just how much he donated. Everything from local elementary schools that needed a new piano to 6-figure checks to larger nonprofits, each time asking, just don't say anything about it. When the 35W bridge collapsed, he donated $50K to a fund to help the victims. He was a person, with all of the complexities that entails and a few other extra eccentricities thrown in for good measure. I think he ultimately just wanted to make music, help his community, and keep to himself.